At 57, Bob Ross's son is finally breaking the silence, and what he shares changes everything we thought we knew. Behind the smile, the afro, and the happy little trees was a life full of pain, loss, and betrayal. Why was the man who brought peace to millions quietly suffering alone? And who really controls his legacy now? From legal battles to secret heartbreaks, Steve Ross opens up in a way we've never heard before. If you thought Bob's story ended with his last painting, think again. This is the side of Bob Ross they never wanted you to hear. Stay tuned. The calm voice we all knew was hiding something. Bob Ross had the kind of voice that made the world slow down. Soft, soothing, full of warmth. For millions, it was the sound of peace. But now, decades later, we're learning that voice might have been hiding something. Steve Ross, Bob's only son, has finally spoken out. And what he reveals isn't meant to destroy the image we have of his father. It's meant to make it real. To the world, he was serenity, Steve said, but I knew the storms he kept inside. When we rewatch clips of the joy of painting now, it's hard not to notice. Bob's calm wasn't just for show. It was a kind of armor. Behind the smiles, the quiet brush strokes, and those famous happy little trees, there was a man carrying a weight no one could see. Steve explains that his father was under pressure every day, pressured to perform, to stay soft-spoken, to never let the cracks show. He was tired, Steve admitted, but he never wanted to worry anyone. Even when he was in pain, Bob kept showing up. The more the public loved him, the more he felt like he couldn't let them down. It makes you wonder, was Bob truly happy while painting on TV? Or was he trapped in the very image he'd created? It's a haunting thought. But to really understand where that quiet strength came from, we need to go back. Back to the beginning, before the paintbrush, before the smile, when Bob Ross was a soldier. The military man before the painter. Before he ever painted a mountain or whispered about clouds, Bob Ross was in the U.S. Air Force, not as an artist, but as a master sergeant. And according to Steve, this version of his father was almost unrecognizable. He was loud, tough, the kind of guy who barked orders, Steve revealed. He scared people. Stationed at Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska, Bob learned to be strict. The cold, unforgiving environment shaped him. So did the responsibility of commanding others. It was here, in this stark, frozen place, that the seeds of the painter we'd come to love were planted. And when Bob left the military after 20 years, he made a powerful promise to himself. I'll never raise my voice in anger again. That vow changed everything. It became the foundation of his TV persona. He wasn't just soft-spoken for effect. He was living out a decision to never go back to who he once was. Painting gave him a way out, a path from discipline to peace. It's why his shows felt so sincere. He wasn't acting, he was healing. But even as Bob was building his gentle image, something else was taking shape. A trademark look that would make him instantly recognizable and eventually become his prison. Let's talk about the curls. Secrets under the afro. We all know the look, the denim shirt, the paintbrush, and that unforgettable afro. It became Bob Ross's signature, instantly iconic. But what if we told you he didn't even want it? Steve Ross shared the truth behind his father's hair, and it's not what you'd expect. It was never about style, Steve said. It was about saving money. In the early days, Bob couldn't afford regular haircuts, so he got a perm, thinking it would last longer and cut costs. It worked, but it also stuck. As Bob's show grew, the afro became part of the brand, Fans loved it. Business partners protected it. And Bob, he started to hate it. He got tired of that curly hair, said Annette Kowalski, one of Bob's closest business associates. He could never, ever change it. Even when he wanted to. Even when it no longer felt like him. That's the heartbreaking part. The afro, which symbolized joy and creativity to the world, became a daily reminder of how trapped he felt inside his own image. This was a man who brought freedom through art, yet he couldn't change something as simple as his own haircut.
But image wasn't the only burden Bob carried. In fact, even his earliest friendships were tested by success, starting with the mentor who taught him everything.
The mentor who became a rival. Before Bob Ross was a household name, before the afro and the happy little trees, he was just a man trying to learn something new. And the person who took him under his wing? A German painter with a booming voice and boundless passion. Bill Alexander. Bill was already a star in the world of public television, hosting The Magic of Oil Painting. He introduced millions to the wet-on-wet technique, a method where paint is applied on top of still wet layers, allowing for fast, dynamic landscapes. And it was Bill who first showed Bob how to do it. Bob watched, studied, and eventually met the man behind the magic. Their early relationship was warm, respectful, almost like family. Bob openly admired Bill. He once said that learning from him was like finding light in the dark. He even dedicated an entire episode of The Joy of Painting to Alexander, an unusual and heartfelt tribute in the world of TV. But fame has a funny way of changing things. As Bob's popularity exploded, his name started to eclipse Bill's. Viewers began associating the wet-on-wet technique with Bob Ross, not the man who created it. Bob became the symbol of peaceful painting, while Bill faded into the background. And that shift didn't sit well with the mentor. "I invented wet on wet," Bill once said bitterly. "And he thinks he can do it better." His once proud voice now carried a sting of betrayal. The admiration he once felt for Bob turned to frustration, and then to resentment. In a New York Times interview, Bob was asked about Bill and didn't sugarcoat it. "He's our major competitor now," Bob said. It was the first public sign that their bond had fractured. The language of mentorship had been replaced by the language of business. For Steve Ross, it was painful to watch. "My dad admired him," Steve admitted. But success complicated everything. What started as a teacher-student dynamic, built on trust and shared passion, slowly turned into a silent standoff. Miscommunication, pride, and the pressure of fame created a rift that was never repaired. It's one of the quiet tragedies in Bob's story. He didn't want enemies. He wasn't looking for competition. But sometimes, even when you try to stay gentle, the world doesn't stay gentle with you. And this wasn't the only heartbreak Bob would carry. This rivalry may have wounded his heart, but something far worse was already brewing, a fight that couldn't be solved with words or apologies. Because while the cameras were still rolling and the trees were still happy, Bob Ross was already fighting for his life. Let's talk about the battle that no one saw, the one that took place behind the smile, inside his body, and would change everything. The tragic truth about Bob's health. For years, Bob Ross stood in front of a canvas, calm and smiling. But underneath the brush strokes and soft words, something deadly was growing. Steve revealed that long before his father's diagnosis, there were signs. Bob had suffered 2 heart attacks before he turned 50. He smoked quietly, away from the cameras. The pressure, the travel, the constant expectations It all added up. And then came the devastating news in 1994: lymphoma. Bob never told the public. He didn't want people to worry, Steve said. He wanted them to feel peace when they watched him. Even as the illness spread, Bob kept painting. On camera, nothing changed. But off camera, his body was failing him. His afro began to thin. His energy dropped. His voice weakened. Still, he smiled. Still, he painted. He was dying in front of millions, Steve said, and no one knew. It's one of the most heartbreaking parts of Bob's story, how he gave comfort to others while carrying such heavy pain himself. And when the show finally ended, so did the mask. But how did Bob say goodbye? And then what did the end of the joy of painting really mean? Let's find out. The final show and the silent goodbye. The final episode of The Joy of Painting aired on May 17, 1994. To most viewers, it was just another soft-spoken half-hour of mountains, lakes, and happy little trees. But to Bob Ross and to his son Steve, it was the end of something far bigger. By this point, Bob's health was fading fast. Lymphoma had taken its grip. His body was weakening, and his famously thick afro had already begun to thin. The curls weren't as full, his posture wasn't as strong, and his voice, though still calm, carried an edge of exhaustion. And yet, no one watching knew. That was the kind of man Bob Ross was. Even in the face of death, he chose peace. He didn't want pity. He didn't want attention. He wanted to paint. And he wanted to protect his viewers from the storm that was quietly closing in. He never wanted to bring his pain to others, Steve said, even when it hurt. That's what makes that last episode so haunting in hindsight. There's no big farewell, no dramatic goodbye, just one more painting, one more message of comfort, and then silence. What the world didn't know was that behind the scenes, Bob was preparing for the end. His studio appearances stopped. His circle of communication narrowed. The man who had once been a constant presence on screen became a ghost, quietly slipping away from public life. On July 4, 1995, Bob Ross passed away at just 52 years old. No massive tribute, no televised memorial, just quiet grief, a whisper of a legacy left behind. But what happened after Bob's death was perhaps even more complicated. Because while his soul may have been free, his art and his name were not. And that's where the story gets even more heartbreaking. The art that was never meant to be sold. You'd think that after Bob Ross's death, his original paintings would become collector's items, priceless works from a cultural icon. But surprisingly, Bob's art never hit the auction block. Why? Because Bob Ross didn't paint for profit. Unlike many artists, Bob wasn't trying to build a fortune off his work. Most of the paintings you saw him create on The Joy of Painting were quietly given away to public television stations, to fans, friends, to institutions. Some even ended up in storage, collecting dust. Today, most of those original works sit behind the doors of Bob Ross Inc., a company that manages his legacy. A few made it to museums like the Smithsonian, but they're not sold. They're not traded. They're not priced. People think they're worth millions, Steve said. But my father never wanted that. He wanted them to be seen, not sold. That sounds noble, but the truth is more complicated. Because while Bob Ross Inc. controls the art, the family, Steve included, doesn't see a dime from it. Steve explained that his father's business arrangements left most of the rights with others. Decisions made during his lifetime, often with trust and little legal counsel, meant that after his death, the Ross family had no control over his paintings, his name, or his image. "They locked it all up," Steve said, "and we were left out." What was once about sharing beauty turned into something colder: controlled access, protected trademarks, and tightly managed licensing. And that leads us to the part of the story Steve says hurts the most. Because it wasn't just about art or money, it was about a father's memory trapped in contracts. A legacy trapped in legal limbo. Bob Ross built a legacy with nothing but a brush, a canvas, and a voice so soft it felt like a hug. But the tragedy is, he doesn't own it. His family doesn't own it. His legacy, his name, his voice, his very image, belongs to someone else. It all sits in the hands of Bob Ross Inc., the company that was originally formed to support his artistic empire. Today, that same company controls everything: the licensing, the branding, the merchandise, the footage. If you see Bob Ross on a t-shirt, a mug, a Halloween costume, or a Netflix special, it all goes through Bob Ross Inc. But here's where the pain comes in. Steve Ross, Bob's only son, doesn't have control over any of it. He doesn't receive royalties. He can't freely use his father's name. He can't tell his dad's story, not without permission. And that permission often comes with strings, lawyers, and red tape. This isn't about money, not for Steve. It's about memory. It's about truth. "They took him away from me," Steve said, "not just as a father, but as an artist." Court documents reveal the hidden side of the business, the one fans never saw. Years of legal disputes, confidential settlements, even footage of interviews with Bob's closest friends, destroyed or buried because it didn't match the company's version of his story. They wanted the brand, not the man, and Steve was left on the outside looking in. "He just wanted to make people happy," Steve said. "He never thought it would come to this." But it did. The same man who gave away his paintings, who taught for free on PBS, who encouraged people to embrace mistakes and find joy, somehow ended up trapped in contracts that silenced his family and shielded the truth. And the irony is painful. Bob was known for avoiding conflict. He didn't like arguments. He didn't want drama. He was gentle to the end. But sometimes, the price of peace is too high. In trying to avoid tension, Bob may have signed away the rights to his own story. He trusted people who, years later, would use that trust to build an empire that doesn't include his only child. Today, Bob's face is everywhere. His voice lives on in clips, his smile sells products, and his persona powers a multi-million-dollar brand. But where is the man in all of that? Where is the father, the friend, the mentor? That's the version Steve is still trying to bring back. It's not just a legal fight. It's a fight for legacy, for dignity, for the chance to show the world who Bob Ross really was, beyond the licensing deals and corporate filters. And that's what makes this story so human, so heartbreaking. Because behind every trademark symbol next to Bob's name is a son still grieving, still fighting, and still trying to bring his father home. But legal battles weren't the only weight on Bob's shoulders. Even when the world thought he had it all, the truth about his finances paints a very different picture. Fame with no fortune. Bob Ross was everywhere, on TV, in magazines, on merchandise. But the man behind the canvas didn't live like a millionaire. In fact, Steve says that Bob didn't make anything from his actual show. "People see you on TV and think you're rich," Bob once said. "But this is PBS, we don't get paid." And he was right. The joy of painting wasn't a big money deal. PBS didn't pay hosts. Bob did the show for exposure. not a paycheck. To support himself, Bob had to hustle. He taught painting classes around the country, produced instructional tapes, and wrote books. That was how he made a living, not through TV fame, but through side work. It's hard to imagine now. A face that became a brand, a man whose art touched millions, living paycheck to paycheck. Steve revealed that even as his father's fame grew, the financial pressure never stopped. It followed Bob right to the end. He gave so much, but he didn't get to enjoy it, Steve said. And while Bob kept his financial struggles private, the stress weighed heavily behind the scenes. Because being famous doesn't mean you're free. Sometimes it just means more people watching as you struggle quietly. But even with the money pressures, legal battles, and health crises, Bob Ross kept going. Though, as Steve tells it, the person the world saw was only one side of a very complicated man. Private life, public pain. Bob Ross was private, deeply private. For someone who spent so much time on screen, he revealed very little about himself. And now, years later, Steve is starting to open up about what really went on behind that warm smile. His father's first marriage ended in divorce, reportedly due to infidelity. It was a side of Bob that few could imagine. But Steve confirmed the truth. He made mistakes, Steve said. He wasn't perfect. Later, Bob found love again with Jane, his second wife. But their time together was tragically short. Jane died of cancer in 1992, leaving Bob devastated. They had no children, and her loss created a deep silence in his life. Bob married a third time just 2 months before he died. It was a final gesture of love, but also a reminder of how short his time really was. Behind all of this, Bob fought hard to keep his private life private. He rarely gave interviews. He avoided gossip. Even those closest to him were kept at arm's length. He wanted the world to feel safe, Steve said. But he didn't always feel safe himself. There was pain beneath the paint, loss behind the landscapes. And that quiet heartbreak can be seen not just in Bob's story, but in the art itself. Because if you really look at his paintings, they tell you something no one else ever could. The man who accidentally created ASMR. Long before ASMR became a viral internet trend, before millions of people wore headphones just to hear soft whispers and tapping, there was one man already doing it, without ever saying the word. Bob Ross. The gentle painter with the curly afro, the calm smile, and the quiet voice wasn't just teaching art. He was soothing souls. And the craziest part? He didn't even know it. His soft, deliberate voice, the sound of brush bristles gliding over canvas, the rhythmic beat as he cleaned his brush, what he lovingly called beating the devil out of it. All those sounds, all those gentle motions were ASMR triggers before ASMR had a name. I don't think he knew what he was doing for people, Steve Ross said. But he felt it. And that's what made Bob different. He didn't set out to go viral. He wasn't trying to chase a trend. He was just being himself, completely, authentically himself. Years after his passing, the joy of painting found a second life online, on Twitch of all places. A platform usually known for gaming suddenly became a safe haven for quiet, peaceful painting. Bob's reruns started streaming non-stop, and what happened next shocked everyone. Young people, many who weren't even alive when the show first aired, began watching, not just casually, religiously. They tuned in not because they wanted to paint mountains or lakes, but because Bob made them feel something they didn't get anywhere else: calm. That's when the ASMR community took notice. The gentle tap-tap of the palette knife, the rustle of canvas, the soothing cadence of his speech. For many, it wasn't just relaxing, it was healing. Bob became an unintentional therapist for millions of anxious, overworked, and overstimulated minds. Joan Kowalski, president of Bob Ross Inc., eventually dubbed him the godfather of ASMR. And it's easy to understand why. Every element of his show, from the way he whispered through each stroke, to how he gently reassured us that we don't make mistakes, just happy accidents, was an emotional lullaby for adults who needed comfort. But here's the part that breaks your heart. Bob was giving the world peace, while he himself was quietly drowning in pain. Health struggles, legal battles, the weight of fame, loss, loneliness. He hid it all from the cameras, from the world, maybe even from himself. That's the bittersweet truth Steve wants people to understand. That while we were watching Bob to feel better, he was struggling to hold it all together. He made the rest of us feel calm, Steve said, but inside, I don't think he ever really felt that peace. It's a paradox, isn't it? The man who soothed the world couldn't soothe his own heart. And yet, maybe that's why he was so good at it. Maybe it's the pain that made the peace so powerful. Maybe in painting those quiet forests and snow-covered hills, Bob wasn't just showing us how to make a scene, he was showing himself a place he wished he could go. And if you look closely at those paintings, at the stillness, the quiet cabins, the absence of people, you'll start to see it. Because Bob Ross wasn't just creating art, he was creating sanctuary, one brushstroke at a time. The paintings that reflected a lonely soul. Bob Ross painted over 30,000 landscapes in his lifetime. Mountains, trees, lakes, cabins. But if you really look closely, something's missing. There are no people. The cabins have no smoke in the chimney, no signs of life, no families in the windows, just stillness. To Steve, these weren't just scenic choices. They were clues, hints about who Bob was and how he felt. He painted solitude, Steve said, because that's what he knew. The irony is that Bob made a career out of connecting with people. Yet in his art, he created spaces of complete isolation. Beautiful, yes, but haunting in their emptiness. Bob once said, "In my world, there are no mistakes." That was his mantra. But maybe what he was really saying was, in my world, I control the outcome. No heartbreak, no legal fights, no cancer, just nature, just quiet. And that quiet may have been his way of coping with grief, with pressure, with loneliness. He gave us happy little trees, but maybe he was building a happy little world to escape into. One where things didn't fall apart, where loss didn't happen, where he could finally feel safe. It's something Steve understands deeply now, and it's what fuels his mission, not just to share Bob's story, but to reclaim it. And in the end, that's what this whole video has been about. A son, a father, a truth finally set free. A son's final words and the battle to reclaim a father. Steve Ross stands today not as a celebrity, not as an artist seeking fame, but as a son trying to honor his father, the real one. The man the world saw was just one version of Bob Ross. The soft voice, the gentle brush, the calm smile. But behind it was a person who struggled, who sacrificed, and who lived a life more complex than any painting could ever capture. Steve has spent years fighting to tell the truth, to speak freely about who his father really was and what he endured. It hasn't been easy. Legal walls, corporate resistance, misunderstandings. But he keeps going. Because for Steve, this isn't just about legacy. It's about love. He just wanted to make people happy, Steve once said. And they took that from him. Those words hit hard, because in the end, Bob Ross's story is both beautiful and heartbreaking. A story of a man who gave the world peace, but rarely had it for himself. And now, decades later, it's his son who's painting the final strokes of that story, layer by layer, truth by truth. Bob Ross didn't just teach us how to paint trees and clouds. He taught us how to look for light in the darkest places, how to make something beautiful, even when everything feels broken. So the next time you hear his voice, pause, and remember the man behind it. Now, you know the truth behind the calm voice and the famous canvas. Bob Ross was more than an icon. He was human. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us tell more stories that matter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.